I'm Brad, and I've been a tour guide for nearly 10 years. It's been my pleasure to show the best that my country has to offer to the hundreds of guests I've hosted over the years. Now you get to be my guest as I take you on an eco tour of paradise. Hey guys, my name is Brad. I want to welcome you to the pine forest of Grand Bahama. Grand Bahama is one of 4 pine islands in the Bahamas, and the pines basically need fresh water to grow. All right, healthy pine forest is a clear indication of an adequate freshwater source. So basically, we have an abundance of fresh water in the form of our underwater cave systems. It's a collective of rain that filters through the ground and collects in these caves on top of the salt water. We get into further detail with that on later videos. But I just want to emphasize how important our pine forest is for the little wildlife that we have in the Bahamas. Okay, there's limited diversity in the wildlife, and places like the pine forest would be more or less of a refuge for certain type of animals. But what we're going to do right now is get into the vegetation specifically. Now, naturally, when you think pine forest, pine is the first thing that comes to mind, and these are called the yellow Caribbean pine, and this is a special species to the Bahamas. You can't find these anywhere else in the world. They've basically adapted to life exclusively in the Bahamas. All right, so up here we have one up close, and you'll notice there are striking characteristics that separate it from other pines that you might be accustomed to, and one of them in particular would be the fact that it doesn't have any lower branches. Now, this is a necessary adaptation for these pines to be able to live in the Bahamas, because our pine forests here are also known as fire climax communities, and this simply means that they need fire for continued growth. All right, basically the pine forest is very sensitive. It is an environment that needs 3 particular factors to grow comfortably. First of all, we need space. Notice how evenly spaced all the pines are. It's almost as if they were planted, but their natural dispersal allows them to be far enough from each other where they don't interfere with each other's root systems and so forth. But also, they need fresh water. I mentioned earlier that we have a lot of fresh water in the island, and the last important detail or factor would be that they need adequate sunlight. Now, there are a few other competing ecosystems that could potentially choke out our pine forests. Invasive ecosystems such as the blackland coppice. We will cover that on another segment as well. But the blackland coppice is very fast growing, very thick, and it could potentially choke out the pines and rob them of the 3 essential I mentioned earlier. So the pines need this to be taken care of, this potential for invasion. And the way they handle that is with these fires that occur quite normally and naturally. Now, all right guys, right behind me I have what's known as the southern bracken fern. The southern bracken fern is actually responsible for a lot of the naturally occurring fires that we have in the pine forest. Now, how would a fern cause a fire? Basically, the fern does something associated with spontaneous combustion, or you can call it spontaneous combustion, and that's basically due to the fact that it dies, it becomes very dry and brittle, like this set right over here, and when it dies and becomes so dry and brittle, it decreases its flash point. Flash point is the degree of which it can catch on fire. So if the flash point is a lot lower and it's susceptible to catching on fire easily, and you compile that with the matting that it does, it basically, all the dead ferns pile up one on top of the other, and they trap humidity. So that trapped humidity is more or less a breeding ground for bacteria. That bacteria is generating energy through eating the simple sugars found in the vegetation, and that process of converting that into energy generates a little bit of heat. So a little bit of heat, a lot of this bacteria, a low flash point, this combination equates to fire, okay? And you can add accelerants to that equation, catalysts, if you will, things like methane buildup due to the decomposition of other matter in the bush, and that will fuel that smoldering into what turns into eventually a fire. And ironically enough, the fern is the first thing to grow back. So this is a process that repeats itself. Now there are a few other types of vegetation that we can find pretty regularly in our pine forest. This one, for instance, is probably one of my favorites. This is called the chicken toe tree, or the five-finger tree. The genus and species would be the Tabebuia bahamensis. This is another one of our endemics. And again, like the pine, it's gone through the process of adapting to this environment where it's basically separated itself from its origin species. And the Tabebuia, there's a bit of folklore behind it and its medicinal use. Now, we have these types of vegetation that we call bush medicines in the Bahamas and the Caribbean, where through boiling you can chemically activate their medicinal properties. And through the years, we've formed together a catalog of different bush medicines to help people with ailments, and we'll discuss that as well in another segment. But this is another type of vegetation you can find in the pine forest. As we walk along, you'll see a vine that's attaching itself to practically all of the foliage in the pine forest. It's an orange vine. It's known as love vine. Now, love vine is a parasite. Okay, so unlike other types of vegetation that can gain sustenance on their own, the love vine has to attach itself to a host plant, and it draws sustenance from the host plant, not necessarily killing it, leaving it with enough life to be able to sustain its parasite. And it doesn't quite matter what the vegetation is, it'll attach itself to anything that it can really get close enough to. Now, it can choke some of the vegetation that it's attached to. It can also block it from photosynthesizing, but in the end, ultimately, it's gaining as much nutrients as it can from its host plant. And another type of vegetation that is quite interesting that you'll find in the pine forest is this little guy right here. Now, this is what we call a century plant. It's also known as an agave. Now, this century in particular is known as the yellow century agave. And the yellow century agave is one of 9 species that are native to the Bahama region. Now, the reason it's called a century plant is because it spends, 10 to 15 years at a roseate level like this before it has the potential to grow tall stalk to about 8, 10, 12 feet tall with beautiful bursting flowers. It's able to disperse its seed and then it dies. So it spends most of its life at a very short level. Now, these types of vegetation are also comfortable with growing in the pine forest because they have succulent nature. They retain a lot of water inside of them, and they have a very tough cuticle. The outer layer of their skin is very tough, so they're able to be fire retardant, so the fire doesn't really have an opportunity to penetrate through the cuticle, and it also retains that hydration so it doesn't really dry out in fires. I'm glad I got to share this part of my home with you. If you've enjoyed the tour, be sure to click the like button and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Maybe I'll see you on our shore soon.